In the mid-19th century, the American West was an ocean of grass, dust, and raw ambition. As thousands of pioneers, prospectors, lawmen, and outlaws pushed beyond the borders of established civilization, they left behind the safety of courts, churches, and institutional law. Boomtowns sprang up overnight around silver veins and gold strikes, places where wealth was instant, life was cheap, and violence was an everyday currency. But beneath the chaos of the frontier, a quiet, invisible framework was traveling west in the trunks of covered wagons and the saddlebags of lone riders. That framework was Freemasonry. In lawless territories where a man's word was often tested at the barrel of a pistol, the square and compass offered a rare universal code of conduct. Lodges were often the very first civic organizations formed in a new territory, frequently chartering long before a town even had a courthouse or a permanent jail. Tonight, we explore the duality of the Masonic fraternity on the wild frontier. It is a history populated not by flawless icons, but by real men, some who wore the star of the law, some who wore the mask of the outlaw, and all of whom knelt at the same altar. To understand Masonry in the Wild West, one must understand the concept of the lodge as a sanctuary. In the territories, a man's political beliefs, his past, or his profession were stripped away at the door. The Tyler's sword didn't just keep out the uninitiated, it kept out the blood feuds of the street. Consider the legendary lawman Pat Garrett, the Old West sheriff famous for hunting down and killing Billy the Kid. Garrett was a dedicated member of Montezuma Lodge No. 109 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. To the public, he was the ultimate instrument of frontier justice. Yet, the very nature of frontier masonry meant that the man sitting on the bench across from a sheriff like Garrett might be an individual living on the gray edges of the law, a cattle rustler, a saloon owner, or a professional gambler. In these remote areas, lodges often met in makeshift spaces, the upper room of a rugged wooden saloon, a mining company warehouse, or even outdoors on the highest hills under the night sky. For 2 hours, under the cover of darkness, bitter adversaries were bound by a sacred oath to treat one another as brothers. Outside the lodge, a tense manhunt might be brewing, but inside, the outside world was forced to wait. The gavel, for a brief moment, held more power than the gun. But what happens when the bonds of fraternal brotherhood collide with the survival of a community? This question was answered in blood during the Montana gold rush of the 1860s, and what remains one of the most morally complex chapters in Western history. The gold boom towns of Bannock and Virginia City, Montana, were being terrorized by a ruthless gang of road agents known as the Innocents. This gang systematically ambushed, robbed, and murdered over 100 miners carrying gold out of the territory. The alleged mastermind behind this criminal empire was none other than the town's elected sheriff, Henry Plummer. To this day, historians debate the extent of Plummer's guilt. Some believe he was a cold-blooded criminal leader. Others argue he was a scapegoat caught between warring factions. But what is historically verified is that Henry Plummer was a Freemason. As the local government failed to stop the slaughter, a secret group of citizens took matters into their own hands, forming the infamous Montana Vigilantes. They hunted down the innocents one by one, executing them by hanging without a formal trial. On January 10, 1864, they marched Henry Plummer to the gallows he himself had built as sheriff and hung him. The tragic historical irony of the Montana Vigilantes is that its driving leaders, including Nathaniel Pitt Langford and Colonel Wilbur Sanders, were also prominent devout Freemasons. In fact, these very same vigilantes went on to form the Grand Lodge of Montana just a few years later. This was a brutal reality of the frontier. When the law of the land did not exist, Masons were forced to choose between the preservation of civilization and the defense of a brother who had broken his sacred trust to society. Nowhere was this more dramatically tested than in the silver boom town of Tombstone, Arizona, in 1881. The town was a powder keg, split cleanly between two warring factions. On one side were the Earp brothers, led by City Marshal Virgil Earp, a strict, uncompromising lawman. On the other side was Cochise County Sheriff John Behan, a corrupt political operator who openly aligned himself with the lawless outlaw group known as the Cowboys. The hatred between Virgil Earp and John Behan was absolute. It was a rivalry fueled by politics, jurisdiction, and power, which ultimately erupted in blood at the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. Yet, just months before that legendary shootout, a group of men gathered in a makeshift room in Tombstone to establish King Solomon Lodge No. 5. When you look at the founding charter of that lodge, you find something extraordinary. Sitting on the benches together as founding brothers were City Marshal Virgil Earp and his bitter enemy, Sheriff John Behan. For 2 hours under the cover of night, these two men were bound by a sacred oath to put aside their weapons, drop their mutual hatred, and work to build a community. Outside the lodge, they were actively plotting each other's ruin. But inside, the outside world was forced to wait. Once again, the gavel, for a brief moment, held more power than the gun. To this day, a historical rumor persists that even the famous gambler and gunfighter Doc Holliday, along with Wyatt Earp, occasionally stepped into that Tombstone Lodge. While their formal membership remains unproven by official Grand Lodge records, the verified reality of Virgil Earp and John Behan sharing a lodge room proves that the Masonic altar was the only place on the frontier where deadly enemies could find common ground. As the West began to transition from a lawless territory into a network of states, some of the most iconic figures who shaped the global myth of the Wild West were active members of the craft. William F. Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill, was raised a Master Mason in Platte Valley Lodge No. 32 in Nebraska. Cody was a Pony Express rider, an Army Scout, and ultimately the world's greatest showman, introducing the global public to the romance of the American frontier. Throughout his travels, Cody proudly wore his Masonic rings and watch charms, viewing the fraternity as a vital link to dignity and self-improvement amidst a rugged life. Then there was Christopher Kit Carson, the legendary scout, trapper, and guide who blazed trails across the Rocky Mountains. Carson was a member of Montezuma Lodge in New Mexico, the same lodge later frequented by Pat Garrett. For men like Carson, who spent months in absolute isolation in uncharted wilderness, the lodge was an anchor. It was a place where they could reconnect with the core virtues of civilization: temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice. These men did not just conquer the landscape, they brought an ancient tradition of self-molding and philosophical architecture to a wilderness that desperately needed builders. The history of Masonry in the Wild West is a powerful reminder that the fraternity is not a museum piece. It is a living tradition designed to withstand the harshest environments. And as the frontier pushed ever westward, the rugged dust of the 1860s slowly gave way to the steady hum of brick, steel, and glass. Yet, through every shift in the horizon, an unbroken thread remained. From the saddlebag of a lone traveler on the borderlands to the modern offices of today, the moral values of the fraternity traveled quietly across the generations. It wasn't just a physical book they passed down, it was a promise, a timeless compass for men seeking to build a better world, proving that while the world around us constantly adapts, the core of who we are remains anchored. Now that the ancient craft moves forward, our transcendent workshop changes, but our fundamental Masonic principles hold more weight than ever.